So thank you. Hello, welcome. This is the first of our Reborn in Wonder lecture series for the 2022-2023 academic year. I'm very pleased to see you here tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome our guest here tonight. So Dr. Jared Staudt serves as Associate Superintendent for Mission and Formation for the Archdiocese of Denver, and he's the visiting associate. Right? I demoted you there. He's a visiting associate professor for the Augustine Institute. He earned his BA and MA in Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I imagine you spent many times having class with Don Briel, who was one of our original Reborn in Wonder lecture series guests and was also inspirational in the formation of this new institute here. So again, it's a pleasure to have you here in sort of continuing on Don's legacy in that respect. But you didn't stop there. You went on and you got your Ph.D. in systematic theology from Abbey University. He is the author of way more books than I am, a profound amount of books. So many of us are familiar with the book that he edited, Renewing Catholic Schools, which I believe many of the schools in the diocese received this, as Bishop Conley has had a great heart and desire for restoring the mission of our Catholic schools here in the diocese. But there are many other books to his name. So he's the author of Primacy of God, The Virtue of Religion in Catholic Theology, Restoring Humanity, Essays on the Evangelization of Culture. One of the books that he's brought here with us tonight, so he had asked if he could bring some of his books, and they're available there, and if you buy them, he'll sign them for you, right? Correct. And, and one of those is, those of you who are the college students who love your theology on tap, he's the author of The Beer Option, Brewing, Catholic Culture, Yesterday and Today. And he's also the editor, as I said, of Renewing Catholic Schools, How to Regain a Catholic Vision in the Secular Age, and The University and the Church, Don Briel's Essays on Education. So he and his wife, Anne, have 6 children, and he's a Benedictine oblate at Clear Creek Abbey. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Jared Staudt.
Dr. Callahan said that he thought a lot of people would be interested in the book, The Beer Option, so I decided to change my title and talk about beer in Catholic education. What do you think? Okay, fine, we'll stick to why the church educates. Recovering mission in a secular age. And, maybe you've heard the book From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. Now this is going to act up on me.
Give us a second.
Okay. What's that?
Microphone.
Yes, so I just moved it down a little bit, but I don't know if that's helping. So the book From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, which came out from the University of Mary, talks about this transitional age that we're in. That for more than a millennium, we were used to having a culture that supported our faith, in which we could take a lot for granted. That the culture generally was aiming for good things, for justice, to support the family. And that now, in the age in which we are living, kind of this post-Christendom culture, we can't take anything for granted any longer. Right? And so we live in a new apostolic age. And so this applies to Catholic education as well. For a long time, we could simply go along and just kind of do things as we've always done them. But with our secular culture, it's important for us to kind of go back through our history, which is what I'm going to be doing in this lecture, and to really look at our tradition to say, okay, in our culture in which we need to be more intentional about handing on the faith, it's not going to happen by osmosis any longer. Right? What are the principles from our own tradition of educating that can guide us in moving forward in Catholic education? But if we're focused on why the church educates, I actually want to just begin with why we educate. Why do we educate at all? Why do we have schools? And I like to give the example of squirrels. For some reason, it's always squirrels. I don't know, maybe because it's just fun to watch them and what they do. But squirrels do not need to go to squirrel school to figure out how to be a squirrel, to gather nuts and to make baby squirrels and all the things that they do. But human beings actually have to learn how to be human beings. Did you ever think about that? Right? What makes us different from squirrels or dogs or birds or any other animals? It's our intellect and will. That God has made us to know the truth and to love what is good, but we have to discover those things. We're not born just knowing them. There's the truth. I see it, Or we're not just born with virtue, right? Virtue is something that we have to acquire through repeated efforts. And so we have to learn what it means to be human. Not just any kind of human, right? Because we can be very animalistic as well, right? But how to live a life of excellence. And I'm teaching the Confessions this week, and Augustine spends a lot of time thinking about language as well. Right? So when I was a baby, I just kind of screamed, to try to express my desires. But then I listened, and I learned from other people with the words that they were using as symbols of things. And so that's actually the beginning of our education, that we learn from others how to speak. And that marks us as human, right? Because dogs and other animals, they have signs, right? But they do not have a language. They cannot communicate in a symbolic way like we can as human beings. And so when we educate, right, we are really helping people how to think about things, right, and to express their ideas through language so that we can communicate with one another. And in this way, we can actually share our ideas. We can help point people to what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. Of course, we can do the opposite as well. But when we think about education more broadly, right, not just about individuals, we can think about societies. Why do societies care about education? Well, traditionally, it was understood as a handing down of everything that was important to a particular culture. And so it's a kind of tradition. Education transmits what a culture thinks that people should know, so that the culture can continue itself on. And so there is a kind of memory that every society has a kind of storehouse of things that they think are important that have been accumulated from the past, in which they transmit to the current generation so that they in turn can hand it to the next generation. And I think that, as we're kind of thinking about the history of education, that is something that, I think is breaking down right now in our culture. But human beings do more than even that, right? So if they're learning how to communicate in their family, and then they're kind of receiving this heritage from society, human beings think more broadly than that. We think of the whole cosmos and our place within it. We think about the meaning of all things. And even the word cosmos in Greek means a kind of pattern. Right? And so we kind of think of our place within this great pattern, the great order of the universe. And I think ultimately we can see education as aligning what is inside of us, our thoughts, our desires, our actions, with the great order of the universe itself. And of course, as free, rational beings, we are self-directed within that. Right? Squirrels have their place, they know what it is, maybe not consciously, right? And they just do it. But we reflect, we contemplate the meaning of things, and then we deliberately make our contribution to society, and we find our place within the whole. So I think at the deepest level, that is why we educate as human beings. We learn how to be human. But why would the church educate? I think we just simply take it for granted and to say, yeah, Catholics run schools, and we are one of the largest educators in the world. But why? Why do we do that? Why do we spend so much time, effort, resources, blood, sweat, and tears, yes, into running all of our schools? And I think part of the reason why is because we recognize that if education is about learning how to be a human being, well, God is the one who ultimately teaches us that. And so the Bible is a story of education. It's a story of many other things as well. You can view it as a love story, but it is a gradual and progressive revelation of the divine life in which God himself is the teacher. And he's imparting his life to us and teaching us how to follow him. And God as teacher became very concrete for us in the incarnation. And so when we think, okay, when God came to earth, what did he do? Well, one, he was a builder. That's actually the proper translation of tekton. We usually say carpenter, but he was a builder. And he built his church. But he was also a rabbi, a teacher. Right? So he was a builder and a teacher. We can think about that for a while. There's a lot there to unpack. But he gathered disciples around himself. What does the word disciple mean? Does anybody know?
Follower.
Student. That's what it means. Discipulus is the Latin word for student. And so he gathered students. He was a rabbi, a teacher. And what did he tell his students when he ascended to heaven? In Matthew 28, we see the Great Commission. And you know that a lot of times parishes and schools make up a mission statement. I think that's good to kind of get everybody on the same page and focus them on a common goal. But Jesus gave us a mission statement. Go therefore to all nations and make disciples. Students. Make students of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And what do you do with students? Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And then my favorite part, lo, I will be with you even to the end of the age. I hope we're not past the end of the age yet. No. And so that's what Jesus wants us to do. So no wonder we run schools, right? Because he made students himself when he was on earth, and he told his students, go make more students. That's what we're supposed to do. And so he remains the teacher, right? When we make disciples, we do not become the teacher, right? So even if you are a teacher, right, I hope I'm not offending you. We are kind of the go-between, right? Because Christ remains the teacher. He's the master, which is the traditional word for teacher in the ancient world, the medieval world. He remains the master who has students who learn from him how to be human. Right? The same goal. He's teaching them how to live. How to really find their identity in the divine life. Right? As sons and daughters of the Father. And that's what he wants to teach us. And it's all encompassing. Now what's interesting is that when the church went out into the ancient world to make disciples, it looked around and it found a particular method of teaching, which in the ancient world is called paideia, from paidos, child. And the church largely embraced it. Paideia was a way of teaching the liberal arts that was ordered towards freedom. And we know that the church embraced this paideia because we read the apologists, right? And they were drawing upon classical learning of Jesus being the Logos, right? As we see in John's Gospel. And so the apologists told the Greeks and the Romans, hey, you guys are looking for truth. Right? And we see all the philosophers are striving for truth. But we have the truth. Because the one who is truth came to earth to teach us. And so they drew together faith and reason in a beautiful synthesis. That the one who came from heaven to bring us God's revelation is also the one who created the universe. The Logos, right? And Logos could be translated word, could be translated communication, could be translated reason. Right? So God is reason itself. But I think there's another reason why the church embraced paideia, and the church did teach the liberal arts. If you look at the catechetical school of Alexandria or Antioch, we see that the church did teach the 7 liberal arts in the ancient world. And I think the reason for that is that the church understood that to enter deeply into God's revelation, to understand the revealed word, our own reason needed to be rightly ordered. So grammar, logic, rhetoric, the trivium, right? To be able to read, to think, to speak, that this was all necessary to teach the Bible. And so we see the church embracing education as it was understood in the ancient world to be something that freed people. And the church, of course, did not simply embrace paideia as it was. It transformed it into a process of conversion, to be free not just in mind, but in body, mind, and soul. And so if paideia was the Greek way of teaching, we see the church's own unique method of teaching in the baptismal catechumenate, which actually went on for years, right? If you look at Hippolytus' apostolic tradition, he said that the catechumenate ordinarily was 3 years. But it could be faster, he said, for those who were properly prepared. But once again, the goal of the baptismal catechumenate was not to learn information. It was not to be able to speak well and convincingly. It was to be converted to Christ. And so education within the church, yes, it embraced right thinking and right expression, but it ultimately was seeking this transformation of the soul. Coming to know God, not in a philosophical way, but in a personal way. And to really bring the convert into the whole story of salvation. St. Augustine says that when potential converts came to the church, the very first thing that they should be taught was the narration of salvation history. So creation, the fall, and the covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, leading up to the definitive covenant with Christ, which was continued in the life of the church. And so that they would understand themselves as part of God's teaching in the Bible, which continued to their own day. And the way that the baptismal catechumenate was imparted, which today we've tried to revive in what was called RCIA, and now the church is calling OCIA, the Order of Christian Initiation for Adults. But this process was not simply a class. And so it was a training and mentorship in the Christian life. And actually, the Creed and the Our Father were not taught until after the rite of election. So you might have 3 years in the catechumenate, and you were actually never taught the Our Father or the Creed. And so what were you learning? You were learning stories of the Bible, but it was also a mentorship and training in how to live. And so the converts had to be examined to see if their life was really changing before they could receive baptism. And so there were these various stages, right? The initial conversion, the entry into the catechumenate, this transformed life that led to the election, the calling from the church, and then the perfection in the sacraments, in which God's own life was imparted. So if you think of what the goal of paideia was, it was to be a good citizen of the polis. But the goal of the baptismal catechumenate was conformity to Christ through his grace, to be reborn, to be remade. And so the whole process of conversion was ordered towards opening the soul to have the proper disposition of receptivity to God's grace. And so I think it's fascinating to go backwards, right? That the church could teach the 7 liberal arts to train up catechists and teachers and to accept the legitimacy of right philosophical thinking, but then complement that with this whole process of conversion. And so we have to really think of both of them together to understand the church's approach to education. And we can kind of see them melding together. The baptismal catechumenate began actually disappearing in the 6th century when there were not as many adult converts. And it was at that time that monasticism actually proliferated throughout the ancient world. And after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the monastery actually became the central cultural unit of society itself. Why? Well, because the monastery provided actually a center for agriculture, for growing the grapes that were needed to make wine for Mass. And you can kind of see some of those vines there. They also made beer. So, of course, they were central, yeah. But what else did the monks do? Well, they had their own infirmary for sick monks, and they extended that out to the poor and the needy. And so the monasteries became the first hospitals. They also had schools because the monks needed to read. And St. Benedict even presupposes that when you read the rule. He said, if any monk is so lazy that he won't learn how to read, well then put him to work. But if he says it that way, what does that mean? Well, that the monks are expected to learn how to read. And they extended, just like the infirmary was extended as hospitals, so the school for the monks actually became extended as schools for the surrounding populace. Now we know, the average person did not necessarily go to schools, but parents would actually make an oblation of their children to the monastery, so whether they were rich or poor. And so the schools actually became the first training ground for future monks. And so what did they do? Well, they did teach them how to read, how to write. They did study the pagan classics. They learned Virgil so that they could be really good at Latin. But once again, the deepest form of learning here was all-encompassing. And St. Benedict does say that the goal of the monk is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so there was that training of the mind, but just like in the baptismal catechumenate, this was complemented by a conversion of soul in humility and obedience. Because St. Benedict said if the monk wants to be a disciple, then the monk must live as Christ, who was completely obedient to the Father. And so that was the ultimate learning that the monks practiced. And even their secular learning of the pagan classics was ordered towards their study of Scripture, Lectio Divina, this prayerful reading of immersing themselves into the Word of God. And so monastic theology ultimately was very scriptural. And in Lectio Divina, it even becomes a dialogue with God. That God speaks to each one of us in the Scripture. And that our meditation is really receiving that message that God is speaking to us, which then becomes the foundation for our prayer, our movement back to God, which leads to a kind of mystical encounter with Him in contemplation, right? Which are the steps of Lectio Divina, right? Reading, meditation, prayer, and contemplation. And so this learning to be a disciple of Jesus Christ is expressed most completely in the monk's motto, Ora et Labora. Because St. Benedict says that let everything that is done in the monastery be for God's glory. Let the monk's work be prayer itself. And so this is why the whole monastery becomes a model of Christian culture, as we were all trying to learn how to be disciples of Jesus Christ, to not only learn how to read and write, but to learn how to pray, and to learn how to order our work towards the building up of the church and society. Right? And so we see a lot of the key elements of what we're after in Catholic education coming out in the life of the monastery, which I think is a constant reference for us of a kind of contemplative approach to teaching. But it was actually from the monasteries combined with the cathedral schools that we see the growth of the university. And the great example of this is the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in Paris, and then we see surrounding Benedictine monasteries like Saint-Germain, combining in their faculty to form a larger center of learning. And so, of course, it's a great accomplishment of Christian culture and Catholic education that we helped lay the foundation for the university. And of course, the university, the word, is something like a guild, a kind of coming together of students and teachers, the universitas. But it can also be seen to represent the goal of the university, which was to understand the whole. And so in the High Middle Ages, we see this amazing expression of what began in the early church, the coming together of faith and reason. And the church was not afraid of thinking about anything, even the most difficult questions. In the popular culture, everyone says, well, the church in the Middle Ages was repressive. And the Inquisition was out there trying to shut everybody's thinking down.
Actually, how did the medieval universities operate? They said, okay, we're going to have a disputation next week. Everyone bring your best arguments together for why you think God doesn't exist. Literally, right? Well, why he does exist and why he doesn't exist. And we're going to debate these points, right? This was the medieval disputation. And they actually sought out the most difficult arguments, the most difficult problems, and embraced them and thought through them and tried to reconcile things together. We see this even in the method of St. Thomas Aquinas. What does he begin with? Which in each article of the Summa, objections. And some people have said that his objections are actually better than the original arguments that he was basing them upon. And so the medieval university wanted to pursue logical thinking about faith and about reason to their fullest extent. And Thomas Aquinas said that truth is truth no matter the source. And so we see Islamic thinkers, Jewish thinkers, being studied at the medieval universities. And what would they teach? It would begin with the 7 liberal arts once again, and then move to these terminal degrees of theology, law, and medicine. And so theology, serving the church, right? So the great teachers and, of course, priests studying theology. Law, which could also be in service of the church, but, of course, was also in service of society. Medicine, healing. And so this is what learning was ordered towards, right? The building up of the church, the building up of society, and the well-being of the human person, right? This was the goal of learning in the Middle Ages. But within the study of philosophy and also within medicine, we do see the beginnings of the scientific method. I think many people today would be surprised to learn that it was medieval scholastics who came up with the scientific method, which actually came out of the cathedral schools like Chartres, when they were trying to think about the movement of the stars and how that related to God's creation. So theology played a role in this as well. But Bishop Robert Grosseteste, and then the Franciscan friar Roger Bacon, who taught at the University of Paris, that they were the first two to articulate the scientific method, right? Which of course would bear fruit and other things that are maybe not as fruitful later on. Now, this whole tradition was challenged very directly. I mean, Martin Luther in the Reformation tried to break that synthesis of faith and reason. He literally said that reason was the whore of Babylon, along with many other things. And so we see in the Reformation, building upon an earlier tradition of nominalism and voluntarism in particular emphasizing will above reason, right? And that Luther was actually trained in this kind of thinking. And so we see the Reformation kind of putting up faith above reason, kind of fideism. And unfortunately, that's how many people think about Christians today. Just asserting faith in a way that is not rational. And the Enlightenment, and of course I'm moving very quickly here, I understand, but the Enlightenment looked at what Luther did and said, yes, faith and reason, they're separate. Yeah, you can have your faith over there, your private opinions. And so rather than emphasizing faith like the Reformation did, the Enlightenment said, we're going to organize everything, including education, solely based on reason. And so we see this kind of split coming out in modern thinking between faith and reason, which of course has come down to us today. And I think the reason why I put up here scientism is because now we see that even science has become a kind of faith, right? Where there's this kind of ultimate trust in science itself to govern human life, and that it can speak to the whole, right? Because science, of course, in the Middle Ages was a kind of certain knowledge. It was not simply sense knowledge, right? Theology was a science. But today, we say that science is only what we can affirm through sense knowledge, right? It's a great limiting of knowledge to the exclusion of higher truths. And what is the goal of science? Well, Francis Bacon, different than Father Roger Bacon, right? But Francis Bacon in the Scientific Revolution would say it's about power. Right? So knowledge is about power and the manipulation of creation. Right? So not simply a conforming of myself to the laws that I find in nature, but rather controlling and manipulating nature so that it will do what I want it to do, which actually goes back to that voluntarism. Right? And if I had a few more hours, we could talk in more detail about voluntarism, right? But it was a kind of striking at the intellectual legacy of the Greeks and the Romans in the Middle Ages, right? To assert that will and power are more important than truth. And so unfortunately, what this whole legacy, 500-year legacy, has gotten us is a secular culture that divides faith from rational thought. And both sides lose. Even reason, right? Reason becomes diminished when it is cut off from its sources and from its goal in God. And so I think today there's a temptation to kind of fall back into something that the medievals struggled with, the two-truth model, right? So even some of the Islamic thinkers in the Middle Ages said, well, there's a religious truth over here, and then there's a kind of rational truth over here. We kind of keep them separate. And you can believe in both, but they don't really go together. And even opinion polls show that many people think that way, that when you poll young people, they say, yeah, faith and science, they're opposed. They have no idea, once again, that the scientific method came out of the church's own teaching in the Middle Ages. And actually, there's a great high school textbook, Faith, Science, and Reason. And it gives a list of all of the priests who were scientists, some of whom were saints. And it actually goes on page after page after page after page. It's actually quite amazing. Right? So the church has been concerned with the whole. Right? How do we contemplate the truth of reality in faith and reason together? That's how the church has always operated. And yet, today, we can fall into that temptation. There can be secularism even in the church if we keep faith and reason separate. And so, in the last few hundred years, there's been some pretty major developments in education. It is true that throughout human history, everyone was educated in some degree. That is, everyone learned language. Right? Everyone learned the customs of their society. Everyone was educated to some degree. But learning how to read and how to write, that was always seen as a great privilege throughout human history. And with the Industrial Revolution, when many people were kind of displaced from an agricultural society and people began moving to cities, there was a move towards a more universal and then eventually compulsory education. And it's important to think that this is a pretty recent development, right? The first public schools were in actually Poland, Napoleonic France, and then certain states within the United States like Massachusetts. But pretty recently, from the late 1700s into the early 1800s. But how did the church respond to that? Well, we see even going back into the 1500s that there were teaching orders that arose within the church to try to bring the gift of education to more people. But with this rise of universal and compulsory education, what did we see? Even though the church was kind of rising up to teach more and more people, it became government controlled and related to the economy. And therefore, education became more utilitarian in focus. Right? Why did the Greeks teach, or the Romans? It was to come to a kind of perfection of the soul, of the human person. Why did the church teach? To kind of bring to a conformity to Christ, right? Who is the great teacher in Revelation, and he's the creator. Why did governments start mandating education? To have productive citizens. So that's something important to really ponder. And then that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to say, okay, just like the church could bring paideia and conversion kind of together, we have to think, okay, but are we following this kind of modern rise of utilitarian education, Or are we able to really situate that within the church's own tradition of forming the person more deeply? Poor John Dewey, he gets beaten up by, Catholic speakers like me all the time. But, John Dewey said that education is not about truth. And if you went back to ancient Greece, or you went back to the University of Paris in the Middle Ages, and you said, education's not about truth, they would think you were crazy. And you said, no, well, that's the whole point of it, right, is the pursuit of truth. But Dewey said, no, it's not about truth at all. And in fact, there is no truth. And so Dewey's method was called pragmatism. That the purpose of education is to help the student to be able to situate themselves practically within society and to be productive citizens. So the church obviously has not been on the sidelines as this has been developing, right? The public education mandated by the government and controlled by the government. We in the United States have built up the largest private school system in the history of the world. And we just kind of take it for granted. Yeah, we have a lot of schools, but we have more Catholic schools than any other country in the world, and probably more schools than any other country ever had. Why? Why did we do that? Well, because we weren't simply comfortable just sending our students to be taught by the government. That was actually profoundly disturbing to our forefathers. And the U.S. bishops, right, with the Third Plenary Council in Baltimore, the plenary synod there, said that Catholic parents had to send their kids to the parochial school, and that every parish had to run a school. That's how important they thought a proper education in the church was. But unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 50 years, right, Catholic education reached a kind of high point in the 1960s in terms of the number of schools and the enrollment within the schools. And what we've seen is that every single year, without exception, until COVID, we've had less and less Catholic schools and less students enrolled in Catholic schools. As you might think, well, yeah, our country's getting more secular and there's less Catholics. No, there's far more Catholics today than there were in the 1960s. If you look at Catholic population, it's actually gone up very significantly since the 1960s. But Catholic schools have gone down very significantly from the 1960s. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, right? Of course, the 1960s were a time of great turmoil in the church. And so there were actually many thousands of priests and religious who left their vocation at that time in the great upheavals. And so the Catholic parochial system was actually built upon priests, religious, both brothers and sisters teaching in our schools. And so a lot of it has been our attempt to cope with that change. And so as we've recruited lay leaders and lay teachers, that's done a few things. One, well, it's made Catholic education a lot more expensive. Two, it also has made Catholic education less Catholic. Why? Well, because, of course, if you're having a lay brother or a sister or a priest teaching your schools, they have had a lot of formation to understand the Catholic tradition, philosophy, theology. So they've been formed very deeply. Where have we gotten the vast majority of our teachers in Catholic schools over the last 50, 60 years? It's from state education programs. And now I would not say anything bad about state education programs, per se, since I know we're here in relation to one. But I mean, think about it. A state education program is obviously not training teachers for Catholic schools. They're not forming teachers in Paideia or the great tradition of the synthesis of faith and reason. And so that has made our schools more secular, and I know that may sound pejorative, but what I mean by secular is that the faith was seen as something that's kind of added on. Right? And so, well, we're going to run our schools as we've been taught from our training. And then in addition to that, we'll have a religion class where we'll go to Mass once a week, or in some schools it's actually only once a month. And so faith was seen as kind of sprinkles on top of the school rather than something that saturated it from from within. Now, I mentioned there was a kind of change during COVID. Obviously, a lot of parents were very grateful that Catholic schools remained functioning more than public schools during the pandemic. But obviously, public schools are also experiencing a lot of challenges right now. And when I was talking about, education as transmitting a culture, right? There's a great kind of change right now in how our country is understanding our own culture and how we're passing it down and what we want to see our children experience, right? So a lot of parents are saying, well, maybe I don't want that for my kids, right? What they're getting in the public schools. I didn't realize really what they were experiencing there. So what do we do now? And what I would propose is that we have the richest tradition of education in the world. The church knows how to educate the whole person, right? You hear that as a buzz phrase, right? We educate the whole person, and a lot of schools claim that, but they don't. Right? Because we educate body, mind, and soul, and the soul is the most important part of who we are. And so if you teach even just body and mind and you leave out the soul, can you say that you are really educated? You're missing the deepest part of who we are. And then that becomes neglected. And what happens when we neglect the soul? Well, just look around, right? We know what happens. And so I think we as Catholics can recover our great heritage. We can look at how the church has taught in such a formative way, right? Of learning how to live in Christ. I think that's the key. And of course, just as the church learned from ancient Paideia, we can learn from modern methods, absolutely. But we have to stay fixed on why we are really educating. We are educating to make disciples for Jesus Christ. And what we can learn still from Paideia is that it's more important to focus on who we are rather than what we can do. And that if we form people to be someone, right, to learn how to be human once again, and we need to learn that more than ever right now, right? But if we're able to learn to be someone, well, then we can do things properly, in the right perspective. Our schools can bring faith and reason together, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I know I'm running out of time, but I'll talk a little bit more about how we can bring faith and reason together. Our students need mentorship, right? So we think back to the baptismal catechumenate. This is where sponsors come from, of walking with the catechumens as they're going through those years of formation. And I cannot recommend enough a book by Christian Smith called Young Catholic America. And what he says in the book, it's really challenging. He says that, simply going to a Catholic school or a youth ministry program does not have a significant impact on young adults practicing their faith. He said, unless three things are present. And he said the number one thing is actually mentorship, which is then supplemented by instruction, and then finally is lived out. Right? That our students that we're forming have to have ways to really act on what they are learning. Otherwise, it's just ideas that are floating around. And so we form our students through mentorship, that we become models for them. Jesus formed disciples, and he asked them to then disciple. Right? So Jesus was the model for them, and then they became the model for their disciples. And Paul even said that, imitate me. Why would Paul want his disciples to imitate him? Because he became for them a model of Christ. And then, of course, we want our students to be prepared to change society, right? That the Second Vatican Council said the church has two missions, right? That the primary mission is to save souls. But flowing from that primary mission is the mission to transform the world through the gospel. And it says that flows from the first mission. Right, that if we're truly forming souls for Christ, that they will transform the world. That it'll just happen naturally. Right? So that our students will be missionaries for Christ. Now, I've been working in Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Denver for 4.5 years. It's not that long. I've been involved in Catholic education in a number of different ways. I was a DRE in 2 parishes, also a DRE for a diocese. I taught at a Catholic university, graduate school. I founded a high school. And of course, now I'm working in the Office of Catholic Schools. So I've seen Catholic education from a lot of different perspectives. But I think we've really had some wonderful traction in our efforts of renewal in the Archdiocese of Denver. And I think the reason why is this first point, is that we say that everything that we do is focused on the mission that Jesus gave us. And so when we're talking about policy, the first thing we ask with policy is, how does this relate to our mission? And unfortunately, I have to deal with a lot of the difficult things that come up in schools, even transgender issues come up in Denver. And the very first thing when we're working with principals, it's always coming back to this. Why do we exist? What are we really after? And evaluating everything that we're doing from that perspective. So that our Catholic faith really infuses everything. We say that we don't do some things differently because we're Catholic. We do everything differently because we're Catholic. Even if it looks the same, we're doing it differently. We're approaching it differently for different purposes. So even if we're teaching 2 + 2 = 4, we're doing that differently. Right? Because we're doing it from this perspective of witness for Christ, the love of our students, and drawing them towards what matters most. And so from that, we've created a number of programs. We have a leadership formation program to try to raise up leaders who have a supernatural vision and can inspire others. But being a principal is a very difficult job, right? Because, we want you to grasp the supernatural vision and to lead all of your students and teachers and families in that while you're doing about 200 other things. It's an extremely difficult job, but these are the kind of inspired leaders that we are really looking for. We are trying to form all of our teachers in what we call a Catholic worldview. And so we have a Catholic worldview seminar for all new teachers. It's a 4-day intensive seminar, which we try to then follow up on with other seminars on different areas of the curriculum. And we've even created an alternative credentialing program where we no longer say that teachers have to have a state license. They can have a state license. But we are also offering our own credentialing program so that we're not only teaching pedagogy, but that we're also forming them in mission at the same time. Under the direction of our Archbishop Aquila, we've said that the reason why our schools exist is to help all of our students to encounter Jesus Christ. And when Pope Benedict visited Catholic University of America, that's actually what he said. He said, first and foremost, our schools are places where everyone should encounter Jesus Christ. Right? So actually, I would recommend that speech. It's only 4.5 pages. So Pope Benedict's address to educators at Catholic University of America. It was hugely influential for us in our efforts in Denver. And then also helping parents to enter into a partnership. Because, it's amazing. I mean, how many times we hear people say, parents are the first educators, parents are the first educators. Okay, but how are parents the first educators? So I always tell principals and teachers, we need to help parents to understand what that means and to actually empower them in that. So how are we working with them? Do they know what we're really trying to accomplish? Are we inviting them into the faith formation of their kids? Because as Christian Smith said, if mentorship is the number one influence on children, well, it's the mentorship of parents that by far is most impactful. And so just to build on that. So once again, Archbishop Aquila told us that forming disciples, bringing our students into encounter with Christ is our number one priority in Catholic education. And one of the things that I like to really emphasize with our teachers is that if faith is taught, like we teach mathematics, right, that it's simply textbooks, that is not an effective way to form disciples. And we know that, right? I mean, people say, oh yes, I learned that, right? But did it sink in? And so when we talk about forming students, forming disciples of Jesus Christ, what we're really trying to say is that we're bringing them to an interior commitment to the faith. That we're really helping them to encounter God in a personal way, to come to understand who they are in Christ, and to become his committed followers. That's how our Archbishop defines a disciple, a committed follower of Jesus Christ. So to encounter God, to grow in faith, and then to embrace the mission that flows from a relationship with him. But this discipleship, right, if we're learning how to be a student of Jesus Christ, once again, that's not just one aspect of the school. Everything in the school becomes an opportunity for discipleship. And that includes everything that we teach. And so we tell our teachers, right, that we are teaching from a Catholic worldview. And that can sound like a technical term, but it just means how we view the world, right, is that we view it through Christ. Right, that we are thinking like disciples in everything. And I always like to give the example of math. So I already put that out there. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, so any school you would think would teach that. Although you can find some advocates in education right now that are questioning 2 + 2 = 4. But we'll put that to the side, right? So let's just say we're all teaching 2 + 2 = 4. But I think a Catholic school can actually address why. Why is 2 + 2 4? It's not something that you observe in nature, right? It's not like you're going on a hike and you're like, oh, there's the number 2, right? Right there, I see it. No, the number 2 in mathematics is actually an intellectual relation, right? So mathematics is a language, an intellectual language that God used to create the universe. And when we study mathematics, we are tapping into that language of the Creator. And what do we tell our students? Why they're learning mathematics? Well, because you're going to have to use this in the future, right? No, it's because, to go back to the beginning, because this is going to change you. Because when you study the truth, it expands your mind. And that through mathematics, you learn to think logically. That you become a problem solver. And that those skills, the dispositions that you're learning in mathematics, it affects everything else. When you're in literature, that you're able to think about that story differently because of what you're studying in mathematics. And so we teach everything differently. So math and science are tapping into the work of the Creator. That literature and the arts become an opening of the imagination to beauty. That through learning to read and to write, that we have this attention to word and idea, that we can think about complex ideas and communicate them. And gym class, I say gym class is more important than ever, right? Because it's disciplining our bodies and understanding our bodies as a gift that we have to care for. History class. We changed social studies to history in Denver, and that was actually difficult for a lot of people. But we said, why? Because history shows that we're part of the story, right? Just like we said it for the baptismal catechumenate. We're part of a story. We've inherited a tradition. And so that actually places us somewhere. And that helps us to understand our identity and our purpose, and that we're continuing this story in our own lives, and we're passing it on to the next generation. Okay, so to conclude, right, Catholic education is more important than ever. And we need to fight for it. We need to continue to make sacrifices for it. Because our kids need the kind of formation that only we can give them. Right? And when I say we, I mean, yes, the Catholic school, but also Catholic families, right? Whether they're homeschooling or they're partnering with us. But we want this formation in the truth, right? Because we have a crisis of faith that has led to a crisis of truth itself. And we do not know who we are any longer. And so there's a breakdown in this human anthropology of knowing who we are as God made us and what He made us for. This sense of purpose and identity. Our young people are really depressed. They don't know why they exist. They don't understand their purpose. They're confused. And so we have the answer. And the answer is God. God first. God above all things. God always at the center. And He can overcome the difficulties in our lives, in our country, which seem overwhelming, right? And in the church as well, right? That in the church, we always need to make sure that God is at the center. And so I think this time of Eucharistic revival can be a great revival in Catholic education as well. That the Eucharist can be the heart of our schools, the heart of our families, and from that heart, right, this new life can pulsate into our minds, into our hearts, into our lives, so that God can truly teach us how to be human beings. Thank you.